I am no beast of burden, but this video sure was. Welcome back to another video in Noodle's complete Path of Exile lore series. This video covers the history of the Templars. Let's begin. The Templars, unlike most peoples we meet in Path of Exile, are a religious group. While they currently rule over Oriath, they originated on Rayclast before the beast was created by sin and put all the gods to sleep. They were an integral element of the Eternal Empire, like a church and state. The Emperor made the laws, while the Templars were their moral compass. And unlike other races or groups we've seen, they only worship one god, Innocence. Before we talk about the history of the human Templars, let's look at the origins of their god, Innocence, and his brother, Sin, who are both major players in our journey through the story acts of Path of Exile. We first meet Sin and Innocence in Act 5 after the gods have returned to the world. Innocence has taken over the body of the current High Templar, Avarius, and as we make our way to confront Avarius, we can learn about the history of Sin and Innocence through the lens of the Templars who worship him. According to the stained glass windows around the Chamber of Innocence, Sin and Innocence come from someone named the Mother of Two. There's not much known about this Mother of Two, although some have speculated, without much evidence, that Kalandra may be this mother. Kalandra is known for her Mirror of Kalandra, the most valuable currency in-game, and the image for the Path of Exile logo. So even though she is mostly unknown, she is clearly important. Either way, the Mother of Two had two sons, Innocence and Sin. Innocence with eyes of burning red, Sin with eyes of clearest blue. For the Templars, Innocence symbolizes the ideal of humanity, while Sin embodies all that makes humanity corrupt. Innocence listened to his mother, while Sin filled his heart with lies and indulgence, and deafened his ears to his mother's pleas. It's important to remember that this story comes from the Templars, and clearly leans towards favoring Innocence and condemning Sin. The hints of injustice towards Sin begin on the third stained glass, which reads, "When the Mother of Two broke bread, she allowed Innocence to eat his fill, as a reward for his virtuous nature. Sin was cast the scraps to remind him of his worthless ways." Not only is that cruel to Sin, regardless of his nature, it is indicative of the Templar beliefs: defend the pure and destroy others. We will see this line of thinking of righteous damnation throughout the Templars' history. Because of Sin's starvation, he stole a fish from the market and lied to the watchman who caught him, and Innocence saw him steal. Sin then beat his brother until a promise of silence was extracted. But Innocence could not keep a promise made in fear. He told the Mother of Two what happened, and it was decided between mother and son that Sin was beyond rule and redemption. That only purification could cleanse his burgeoning corruption. The terms purification and corruption are especially apt as they are common themes. It is clear that even before this act of stealing, Sin was viewed as an impure outcast by his own family. Their belief in punishment and duty outweighed any kindred feelings. The next part can be interpreted two ways. It reads, "The village gathered to watch Sin become ash and breathed deeply of the smoke that poured from his screaming mouth. Sin filled their lungs, their minds, and their hearts." Literally, this describes Sin being burned alive for his crimes, burning to a smoke the village breathes in. But figuratively, this is either that Sin infects all the people of the village with his corrupt essence, entering otherwise pure beings and corrupting them, or it's that Sin, a god, was brought down to the level of the people, losing his own purity and becoming one with those unrighteous humans, and Innocence recognizing the impurities of Sin in humanity. I think it's a mix of both. Some believe that Sin and Innocence ascended to godhood from men, like many of the other gods we've seen, but this does not seem like a story of becoming a god for either Sin or Innocence. I personally think that Sin and Innocence were born as gods, and this is more of an allegorical tale about how Sin sank to the levels of unpure humanity, while Innocence rose to fight that impurity in humanity after Sin had infected it with his corruption. Regardless, to the Templars and Innocence, The entire village, perhaps representing all of humanity, was corrupted by sin. The story continues, with Innocence watching sin take root in the bodies of men and women and children. He witnessed them turn on each other, first with words, then with fists. The story gets a little strange here. The literal interpretation of the next part is something like a horror story, as if the entire village got turned into the depraved trinity. Friends and kin embraced in mortal struggles, their skin weaving with skin, flesh bonding with flesh, bone entwining with bone, until the village had become one writhing giant, forged of strife and hatred. This particular passage makes me believe this story is more of an allegory for the fall of mankind than a literal description of events. It describes the fall of humanity from grace, all becoming part of sin and his evil ways, rather than some actual Frankenstein event. As this titan of sin rose to its many feet, Innocence knew that the village was lost. With an anguished cry, he committed it to flame. As town and titan burned, the sky turned dark with the ash of sin. There, amongst the raging ruins of his home, Innocence swore an oath. No matter where the ashes of sin fell, his purifying flames would rise to meet them. So Innocence's beliefs are that all of humanity has been infected and is impure, and that which is impure must be burned down to right this wrong and eradicate the sin in humanity. While this story is clearly biased, it does demonstrate the beliefs of the Templars, that the world needs to be cleansed of sin and his corruption, and that innocence and purity is the way to fight this scourge. The first Templar was a man named Maxarius, who lived sometime before the beast was created by sin. We know this because Innocence physically gave Maxarius his sign of purity, a staff that we see in-game that has been with the Templar religion since this interaction. Innocence entreats Maxarius to continue his legacy of purity from within humanity. Where Maxarius lived exactly and his background are unknown. There's some indication that he may have been Val, as the Templar Descry that we see all over Templar sites and gear is actually a Val symbol, or vice versa. The Val were present on Rayclast and Oriath, as we see multiple Val ruins around Rayclast, and Templar Devarro found Val ruins on Oriath. So this information doesn't exactly pinpoint the original location of the Templars and Maxarius. The sign of purity that Innocence gifted to Maxarius was able to conduct and store energy, according to Valenta. But it remained inert when she applied corruption to it. It must only respond to divine energy, and with corruption and divinity being diametrically opposed, it's no wonder that her experiments failed to excite the thing. So, the sign of purity was a receptacle for some of Innocence's divine powers as a god. And thaumaturgy, the power of corruption, accessible to humanity because of sin's creation, the beast, was unable to affect the staff. This reinforces the idea that the power of the gods, divinity, is not the same power that we utilize, thaumaturgy. Their sources are opposed. One might say purity versus corruption. So Maxarius, with this staff bathed in the blood of innocence, began the Templar religion sometime before the beast's creation. And with this sign of purity, Maxarius smote with flame the army of the faithless with one ray of its hallowing light, according to books the Templar Bannon read. Really fulfilling the legacy of Innocence, no matter where the ashes of sin fell, his purifying flames would rise to meet them. Sometime after this, Innocence's brother, Sin, created the beast to put all the gods to sleep with its power of corruption, and stop a war between two gods, Garukan and Shikari, that could have wiped out humanity. Garukan was Sin's former wife, and Shikari was their daughter. This conflict is discussed in more depth in my episode on Act 9. Sin's beast affected all the gods, including Sin and Innocence, and they weren't seen again until we kill the beast in Act 4. The power of the beast, this corruption of nightmare, is the source of all thaumaturgy that humans can wield. That is why High Templar Dominus, who was heavily invested in and mutated by thaumaturgy, could not bear to touch the sign of purity, a conduit for divine energy, even though it is the ultimate symbol of Templar faith. Even in the absence of Innocence's physical presence, the Templar religion continued. Like many people and their gods, Innocence became more a symbol than a literal being. The Templar faith persisted with markings on Rayclast and Oriath through the fall of the Voll. One interesting question that I cannot find answers for is what the Templars thought of or knew of the Voll's thaumaturgy and human sacrifice. They do use the Voll symbol from Zeal's amplifier as their death cry. But it's impossible to think that the Templar would see the Voll's thaumaturgy as anything but corrupt and impure. Human sacrifice is questionable considering the Templars' own history, but I won't get ahead of myself. But imagining the Templars living alongside the Voll during their years of thaumaturgy doesn't make sense. Of course, Maxarius and his encounter with Innocence happened long before the Voll, or anyone had access to thaumaturgy, although there was some level of magic that allowed humans a path to divinity, as seen in many gods we encounter, including the Voll gods Yugel and Ralakesh. But the Templar Order existed during the Voll's rise and fall, and until the start of the Eternal Empire. When Tarkus Veruso and Asmiri brought his people down the treacherous Asmiri ranges to the ruins of Azala Voll to found his new empire, starting 1 IC, the Templar religion followed. According to Trinian, who wrote the text called The Ancients, to care for this empire with eyes open is a traditional vow made by the High Templar upon the coronation of an eternal emperor. While it's not concretely traced back to Tarkus Veruso himself, for many years the Templars lived in and influenced the Eternal Empire. The High Templar was not a ruler of the empire himself, but still an important figure, like a pope. The playable exile the Templar says, Sarn, birthplace of the Templar, upon entering Sarn. While this contradicts the story of Maxarius somewhat, this does show that the Templars became most prominent and established in Sarn amongst the Eternals, rather than being an isolated group on Oriath, as one might presume from the current state of Path of Exile's world. More evidence that the Templars were there with Tarkus Veruso and the founding of the Empire is that Veruso was adamantly against thaumaturgy and corruption. According to the texts The Ancients, Veruso built his capital upon the bones of Azala Voll and baptized it Sarn. True to his word, Veruso ensured that his people lived with eyes open. Thaumaturgy was outlawed, and those who stained themselves with Vallish folly were burned for their sin. Baptism, burning their sin, these beliefs echo the teachings of the Templar. And one of the most important High Templars really believed that sentiment. High Templar Voll, the leader of the successful Purity Rebellion in 1314 IC. As mentioned, the Templars had worked alongside the Emperor without much note, presumably since the foundation of the Empire. For 1300 years, there was no notable division between this church and state. While there were Templars on Oriath at this time, the High Templar was likely in Sarn or nearby. High Templar Voll watched as the Emperor Chittus Parandus, the first non-Frisian emperor since 35 IC, watch my videos on the Labyrinth for more information about Chittus's succession, began studying thaumaturgy and encouraging his empire to do the same, going so far as to implant gems into himself, his army, and fund the experiments of Malachi and his students. These actions were too much for the Templars, believers in purity, to stand by. High Templar Voll is also known as Voll of Thebris, but unfortunately there is no other mention of Thebris in PoE lore or if it has any significance. Voll was horrified by Chittus's actions and saw that same horror in many of the common people of the Eternal Empire. He knew he must take action to stop Chittus and to purify the Empire once more. Clarissa explains this dynamic, saying, Chittus thought that the gemling was the pinnacle of human progress. These glorious gems have brought us within spitting distance of godhood, he once said. The High Templar at the time, Voll of Thebris, thought they were a perversion. He wanted the Empire made pure, cleansed of the stain of thaumaturgy. Many of those in support of or practicing thaumaturgy themselves were eternal elites, so Voll entrusted a famous poet, Victario, known as the People's Poet, to help stir up anger amongst the working class. Victario wrote multiple stories about his experience with those who had chosen to become gemlings, documented in Victario's writings. But he also left graffiti around Sarn, which disparaged Chittis as a monkey king who has built a throne on your back. Other graffiti by him says, "The Monkey King names you slave. No, you are the gems of Rayclast, not the treacherous stones you dig and die for," referring to the mines in which slaves of many races were condemned to dig out virtue gems and suffered horrific mutations and death. And finally, the gemmed genteel are an infestation. They are the Monkey King's fleas that drink of your lifeblood. Crush them in your work-forged hands. Victario and Voll looked beyond the eternal citizens of Sarn to back their purity rebellion. High Templar Voll entreated 3 leaders of peoples who had been systematically mistreated and enslaved by the Eternal Empire: the Karui, the Mariketh, and the Ezamites. Voll knew that all of these people were oppressed under the Empire, and that much of that oppression revolved around Chittis's interest in virtue gems. As mentioned before, people were forced to work in the mines to get virtue gems for the Empire. The Mariketh had been pushed out of their homelands, the Vastiri Plains, so the Empire could further its mining. Karui and Ezamites had been enslaved for various purposes for the Empire for years, although notably without any pushback from the Templars before this time. Whether or not Voll cared about their oppression, he used these people's desire for freedom to help his rebellion. I'm not positive of the order of events here, as the months and days of PoE are somewhat confusing, so I'll present these in the order given by the Purity Chronicles. High Templar Voll wanted the help of Thane Rigwald of Ezamir, but knew that Rigwald would be more inclined to listen to a poet than a politician. So he sent Victario to entreat with the Ezamites in his stead. The Ezamites live west of Sarn in Ezamir. Gaius Centauri was the Eternal General and Governor tasked with capturing and enslaving Ezamites. Voll and Victario knew that the ultimate insult to the Ezamites was to be held captive and made prey by others, as they were a proud people. At Victario's behest, Rigwald led his people to battle against Gaius Centauri, writing later, "We crashed against their legion like waves upon a cliff. Time and time again they repelled us. Yet what is a slave to do? Suffer the lingering death of mine and mill, or offer the gift of your life to your people in one bright and glorious moment? 3 Ezamites fell for every eternal, and still the courage of my people tore down that polished wall, severed the strong arm of the Empire with a rusted woodsman's hatchet." This battle took place on the fields of Glarin, and eventually Centauri and his forces fled back to Sarn. This was all part of Voll's plan. Gaius Centauri asked for reinforcements against the Ezamite rebellion, drawing forces away from the capital city of Sarn to continue the fight in Ezamir. This uprising of the Ezamites is now called the Bloody Flowers Rebellion. High Templar Voll went to Kaum, king of the Karui. Marimoa tells us it's an often told story among the Karui. How Voll of Thebris bent his knee to my ancestor, King Kaum, and promised freedom in return for war. The Karui were known for warfare, in particular their methods of only using melee attacks in combat. The Karui are from a group of islands just south of Rayclast, near Lionai's Watch. Voll wanted the Karui to drive the Eternal Forces out of Lionai's Watch, which were headed by Marcius Lionai, a gemling captain who had replaced his missing eye with a virtue gem. Kiri, Kaum's niece, wanted to help the cause. According to the Purity Chronicles, traditionally, Karui warriors were forbidden from using projectile weapons of any kind. At her uncle's behest, Kiri had traveled to Thebris and studied archery with Voll's finest military tutors. Kaum and his army advanced on Lionai's Watch, with Lionai aware of their melee limitations. After some fighting, Kaum and his army retreated, and Lionai's forces followed them, assuming victory. Kiri then ordered her newly trained female archers to rain arrows upon Lionai's forces. Kaum's army turned once again to engage the combat, and Kaum and his Karui won the battle. Kaum cut off Lionai's head and marched north towards Sarn. Voll also helped the Mariketh in return for aid in his Purity Rebellion. The Mariketh were being pushed out of their lands by a particularly vicious and gem-obsessed general named Hector Titusius, who had replaced every joint in his body with virtue gems. Fun fact, it is believed Hector Titusius was an Ezomite by birth. The leader of the Mariketh, Sekema Deshret, agreed to help Voll's Purity Rebellion in exchange for the death of Titusius. High Templar Voll discovered eternal spies among the Mariketh and fed them false information regarding a potential tribal uprising. The Mariketh were well accustomed to the dust storms of the Vastiri Plains. They could navigate these storms and hide within them, while their enemies would be disoriented. On news of this fake uprising, Titusius had his Gemling legion surround the supplied location, thus placing himself squarely in the path of Deshret's dust storm. The Mariketh attacked Titusius and his legion, defeating them, and Sekema Deshret turned Titusius' skin into a saddle for her Roa. With these reinforcements and unrest building amongst the working-class Eternals, on the last day of Divini 1334 IC, High Templar Voll laid siege on Sarn, his ranks swelled by Ezomite, Karui, and Mariketh rebels. But Voll also had support among Chittis's allies. People like Archbishop Joffrey of the Frisia Cathedral had taken great offense to Chittis's actions, and one such traitor to the Empire was a man named Mayor Ondar. During Voll's siege, on the anniversary night of 1,000 Ribbons, Mayor Ondar stabbed Emperor Chittis. Chittis fought back, and they both died. The rebellion was successful, and High Templar Voll was named Emperor Voll I. This is the first time in Rayclass history that the Templars had become an empire in their own right. But it did not last long. Chittis's favored thaumaturgist, Malachi, was incredibly cunning and with the help of his students was aware of Voll's rebellion before he struck and had prepared for this outcome. Emperor Voll had Malachi's students, Doedre and Malagaro, burned at the stake for their actions. Givron had already perished at her experiment Brutus's hands. Malachi was set to meet the same purifying flames, but told Voll he knew about the source of all thaumaturgy, all corruption, the beast, and that he knew how to destroy it. Voll took the bait. High Templar Emperor Voll locked Malachi in the Solaris Temple to finish his rapture device, which Voll believed would destroy the beast. Malachi calling his machine the Rapture device was probably a manipulative ploy to appeal to Voll's religious values, as a rapture is the transportation of all religious and pure humanity to a state of heaven. Voll's desire to purify Rayclast severely clouded his judgment. As we know, when Voll and his guards marched Malachi and his device to the Highgate Mines, to the heart of that beast, Malachi was not planning to destroy the beast. Rather, his device allowed Malachi to enter the beast's core and merge with it, causing the cataclysm that destroyed Rayclast. This was only 2 years after High Templar Voll had become emperor. Voll died, became an undead abomination, and wrote his final confession. I vowed to care for this empire with my eyes open, calling back to the traditional Templar vow to the Empire. I lied to my people. I lied to myself. Blinded by my lust for purity, I placed my faith in the most corrupt of men. I have failed you, my empire of purity. Voll had hoped to snatch the empire from the claws of devilry and return it to humanity, and instead allowed corruption to completely decimate Rayclast. But as mentioned before, the Templars were not a regional group like others. Although their High Templar was in Sarn, many Templars were also on Oriath, and Oriath was untouched by the Cataclysm. Perhaps emboldened by Voll's rise to Emperor, or because they were the only safe or untouched advanced civilization left, the High Templars became an empire over Oriath, and have been in power ever since. They call themselves High Templars now, fully affirming that this is a theocracy governed by religion. Our playthrough takes place almost 300 years after the cataclysm caused by Malachi entering the Beast, and the Templars still rule from Oriath. While some people still live on Rayclast, there are also people from Oriath who have been exiled by the Templars for their crimes, with the Templar being fully aware of the catastrophic state of Rayclast. And in Oriath, the Templars have continued the tradition of enslaving Ezamite, Mariketh, and especially Karui people. The Templar tradition of purity and anti-corruption or anti-thaumaturgy has wavered in recent years. Starting with High Templar Venarius, the Templar who entreated Valdo Caesarius, Xana's father, to research an ancient map device. Venarius's thaumaturgical study ended with him falling prey to the Elder. High Templar Dominus was Venarius's successor, and this is the Templar who exiles our character to Rayclast for our crimes. Dominus was heavily invested in thaumaturgy after meeting Vinia, a condemned thaumaturgist and prostitute who convinced Dominus that thaumaturgy was divinity and a way to become closer to God, in this case, Innocence. After this meeting, she took the name Piety. As we know, thaumaturgy is directly opposed to the power of divinity, and Dominus could not even touch the sign of purity that was the symbol of the Templars and Innocence. Dominus had the staff locked away in the ossuary. The Templars had strayed far from the path of Innocence. Once we kill Dominus and defeat Malachi and the Beast, the gods are released, and the newly awakened Innocence goes to Oriath to possess the new High Templar Avarius and reclaim the Templars in his image. While we don't know if Avarius was involved in any thaumaturgy like Dominus, he certainly participated in the oppression of the people High Templar Voll had championed for his purity rebellion. Utula, a freed Karui slave in Oriath that we meet in Act 5, says, "With Dominus away in Rayclast, someone had to keep the wheels of oppression turning." It was Avarius who led some of the largest and most crippling raids upon the Namakanui and the Nakura Makoi. It was on his orders that men, women, and children were shackled and shipped like cattle to Theopolis. And it was Avarius who spent 5,000 Karui lives building his Templar courts and his Chamber of Innocence, who had wives and daughters scrub their husbands' and fathers' blood from the stones so as to preserve their purity. Did Innocence choose Avarius simply because he was the High Templar? Most likely. But does Innocence care about the actions of the Templars in his absence? Probably not. Sin tells us that humanity's general well-being has never been of particular concern to my brother. Innocence and the Templars care more about making the world in their image and burning all those who don't match or oppose that image than actually helping humanity. When we defeat High Templar Avarius, Innocence leaves his body and makes his way to a somewhat disillusioned Templar, a man named Bannon. Bannon seems to be against much of the cruelty the Templars have committed. Regarding Innocence, Bannon says, "For a long time now, I thought my god's intentions were being twisted by his supposed servants. Did I speak up? No. The pyre would have been my only answer. I did what I was told and drew the lines of morality where I could. Now I understand the truth. It wasn't Innocence's intention being twisted. It was Innocence himself, perverted by the selfish convictions of the men and women who worshipped him. A god answers to the believer as the believer answers to their god." And while there may be some truth to this, we have seen Innocence act unfairly to his brother Sin, shielding himself with righteousness in the face of his cruelty. He believed in purifying those who do not agree with him, with flames. Perhaps influenced by Bannon, or maybe because Kitava is undeniably evil, Innocence decides to help us defeat Kitava. After our success, Innocence and Sin have a chat in the epilogue of Oriath. Sin and Innocence seem to reconcile their differences. Sin apologizes for creating the beast, and Innocence regrets the countless millions he's murdered. Innocence decides not to stay in Oriath amongst the ruins of his making. Instead, he says he will go as far south as he can travel to isolate himself. Innocence says to us, "You have heard my admission of guilt and my plea for forgiveness, Yet I sense in the glowing embers of your eyes that you will be glad to be rid of me. I don't blame you. The sins I've committed, although bad enough, are made worse by the lens of pride I once viewed this world through. Innocence seems to have seen the error of his righteous, pure ways. But what about the Templars? With High Templar Avarius dead and Innocence gone, who will lead them? Will they admonish their past of slavery and oppression? Will they continue exiling and burning those who stand against them? We see in Conquerors of the Atlas that Baran hopes to rebuild the Templars under his rule within the Atlas. Who knows? I hope we will find out in PoE 2. Thank you so much for watching. It's your boy Noodle. If you liked this video, there are more videos like it in the playlist below. Thanks to all my subscribers and of course my wonderful patrons for voting on this topic. If you have any questions about the lore, or just want to watch me do weird builds in Path of Exile, check out my Twitch at twitch.tv/KittenCatNoodle. And yes, I will be doing a series about the Conquerors of Atlas. But until then, by the muscular golden arse of innocence, stay sane, Exile.